Welcome to the fourth series of Understanding Islam. This is week 4, when we're going to look at the Hadith, the traditions, the reports, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. Two things that the Qur'an says are of great importance here. The first is, it says that Muhammad is a perfect example of how to live a Muslim way of life. He is like the living Qur'an. You see him, you follow his example. Secondly, the Qur'an says that he never speaks out of his own will. He speaks only by the will of God, and therefore his speech, what he says, what he teaches, these are protected from error. Therefore they can be relied upon. Now, it's no surprise then that his followers, his early community, paid great attention to the way that he put the Qur'an into practice, what he did, the things he approved of, and to the things that he said, what he taught. These then were remembered by people with first-class memories. These are people who relied on their memories. Some of them could write, and some of them wrote down the sayings of the Prophet, but most people were relying on their memories so that they could then repeat them to other people. And you can imagine the situation that people would come home from a day in the market, or they would come back from a journey to Medina, and their family would be saying, "What did you hear that was new from the Prophet?" And then they would narrate, "I was there, I heard the Prophet say. I was there, I saw the Prophet do." And they would be narrating these to their whole families, including children. So even young children at that time would be memorizing the sayings, the hadith of the Prophet. So we see them being remembered, we see them being repeated, and we see them being recorded, both in the memory and also in writing. Now, we can say that there are 3 types of speech that flow from the mouth of the Prophet. There are the words of the Qur'an, and the Prophet knew that at this time he was not in control. He was the conveyor, the spokesperson of the Word of God. Secondly, we have his own words, his own speech and teachings. But thirdly, we have a group of sayings which we call Holy Hadith, Hadith Qudsi. And these are sayings in which God is the speaker. They are given to the Prophet for him to relay to the community. And so we can divide out these 3 types of speech in his own diction, in what he says. And our main concern today is on his hadith, the hadith of the Prophet, they're called. Now, there are limits to the knowledge of the Prophet. He makes it clear some things are known only to God. And yet, because the Prophet has been on this mysterious night journey, the Miraj, he has entered into the court of the Prophet. He has therefore heard from the Prophet things that are not able to be discerned by any other human being. So we say he has knowledge of the unseen, which has been given to him by God. But still there are limits. There are limits on the other end of his knowledge too. He is not an expert on every facet of life. So we have a famous example of some people who were date palm growers. And they wanted to ask the Prophet if this was the best time for them manually to pollinate the date palms. And in the end, the Prophet says, "You've been doing this for a very long time yourselves. You know much better than I do." So the Prophet has privileged knowledge, but there are some things that God alone knows, and then there are other things that other human beings know better. We need to explore the way in which these hadith were collected, were tested, were criticized to make sure that they were accurate in each of the different two main schools of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia traditions. So let's take the Sunni practice first of all. You can imagine the situation. There were people who were coming back from the presence of the Prophet, and they would report to others. If somebody heard a saying from the Prophet, they would say, "Where did you get that from?" "I was in the presence of the Prophet and I heard him say," or "I heard it from so-and-so, and he or she was in the Prophet's presence and heard him say." Now, you've got a link in the chain there, and you need to make sure that that link is sound. Who is that person? Are they upright and reliable? Is there anything known about them that would make one believe that they are not telling the truth, that they're a known liar, or they make things up? Were they in the right place at the right time? So you get these chains of narrators who pass on the hadith of the Prophet. And each of those links in the chain has to be carefully scrutinized. Now you can imagine the situation that there might have been a dozen, there might have been 100 people present when the Prophet said or did a certain thing. And so you can have multiple chains. One person says it to another and so to another, but then another person starts another chain of narration. Now, if you find a saying with multiple chains of narrators, that's very good news, because that's an extra guarantee, an extra reassurance that it is authentic. The wives of the Prophet were in a privileged position because they spent so much time with him, so therefore they were able to transmit these hadith directly from him. Women in general are very much favored as people who narrate hadith because women tend to live longer. And so as time goes by, you tend to get fewer links in the chain of narrators if you have women there, because they tend to live longer. These people who narrated directly from the Prophet are called companions. And so the principle develops that companions are to be trusted because the Prophet said that these are the best of the generations, they are my generation. Now, who's a companion then? So different definitions are used, but the one that comes to be most widely accepted is that a companion is someone who saw the Prophet while they were a Muslim and died a Muslim. Now that gives you a very wide focus, a very wide spectrum for who qualifies to be a companion. And the last of the companions that we know of is recorded to have died in the year 711. Now, that is 79 years after the death of the Prophet. And so you have a very long period there, and he must have been a very young boy at the time that he heard the Prophet say those things. So you get the idea of a chain of transmitters that hand on a hadith in this way. And this chain is called the isnad. There were hundreds of thousands of hadith that circulated in the early Muslim community. One of the great collectors of hadith, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, is said to have known 1,000,000 hadith. And he leaves us a book, a collection of hadith that contains 30,000. Another of the early collectors, Malik ibn Anas, in his Muwatir, he actually has not only hadith from the Prophet, hadith from the companions, but also some sayings that he has himself. So you can see that you've got quite a pool of hadith that are circulating at this time. By the time that we get to the 9th century, you have in Muslim lands the ready accessibility to paper. Once you can get your hands on quantities of paper, then we start to find a movement of collecting and sifting these hadith. And the great Sunni collectors of hadith belong to the 9th century. People like al-Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Majah, al-Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, and so on. So we get 6 major Sunni collections of hadith that date from this period. But if we take Bukhari, for example, Bukhari says that he knows of 600,000 hadith, and he has then fined these down. He has rejected hadith that he decides are not reliable. And in his collection is called Sahih. Only the most reliable hadith are here. And there are less than 8,000 hadith. So he's gone from 600,000 that he knows down to 8,000 that he regards as being wholly reliable. In the same way, we have Muslim in his collection, which is again only Sahih, only the most reliable. We find some duplicates with the work of al-Bukhari, more than 2,000 of them, and we find quite a lot of multiple chains of transmission going on down through these works. So we get the message then that a great deal of sifting was necessary. Sifting, checking out the narrators. Who were they? Are they reliable? Were they in the right place at the right time? Could they have met each other? Do we know anything about them? Is there anything against them? In particular, are they known in any way to be unreliable? And so you sift the hadith according to the chain of transmitters. You find that lots of books have been written, biographies of the different transmitters of the hadith, so that you can investigate them as closely as possible. Now, this process of investigation still goes on to this day, because no Sunni scholar will say that every Sahih hadith is contained in Bukhari and Muslim. They are contained elsewhere as well, and so the process of sifting through the hadith is an ongoing process up to today. So remember, al-Bukhari starts with 600,000, and he gives us about 8,000 in his work. If you take all 6 of the Sunni great collections of hadith, you only amount to about 20,000 hadith that they regarded as being reliable, critically proven to be traced back to the Prophet. We do not have a precise list of all those who qualify to be companions of the Prophet, but they must number some tens of thousands. Indeed, of those companions that are cited in the 6 great Sunni collections of hadith, you have about 1,000 companions who are listed there. Now, this process of cross-checking includes checking what happened to transmit them between teacher and student, because the teachers often would recite them to their students. The students would take them in dictation. They would explain the meaning to the student. The student would then perfect their knowledge of the text and of the commentary, and then the teacher would ask them to recite them back, to read them back, and he would in this way check the manuscript. Now, obviously, if the teacher was teaching over a period of decades, then we ought to find that exactly the same thing was being taught in year 1 that was being taught in year 21 or 31. And so discussing and examining the work of the teachers becomes important here. and eventually we get a classification of these hadith. Those that are reliable in every way are called sahih. Those that are good, but there's just some slight imperfection in the chain of transmission, these are called hasan. And then you go down into those categories that have weak hadith, and the lowest category are called da'if. And da'if means that there is some flaw there which makes them unreliable as a source of law, but they can still be used by the piety of the people. Now, so far, all this criticism has taken place regarding the chain of transmitters, the isnad. But what about the content of the hadith? The content we call the matn, the body of the hadith itself. And the first point of critical appraisal is, does it in any way contradict the teaching of the Qur'an? Because if it is, it cannot be accepted. Secondly, does it accord with the general teaching of other hadith of the Qur'an in other places? Thirdly, does it accord with the general consensus amongst the scholars? Then comes the question of reason, and we get two traditions within Sunni hadith scholarship. Those who say that reason should play a very important part because it must be rational, it must make sense. Otherwise, God is reasonable, God is knowledge. God does not act in irrational ways. The other schools say, well, as long as you can prove that it comes from the lips of the Prophet, God and the Prophet know more than you do. So even though your reason cannot help you to understand it, it's still an authentic hadith and you should still put it into practice. So you can see there's a variety of hadith criticism going on here. And indeed, the scholars of hadith are regarded as being one of the most demanding disciplines within the whole body of Islamic studies. If we look at the question of the hadith within the Shia tradition, then the way of classifying and authenticating the hadith is somewhat different. First of all, let's consider who were the closest people to the Prophet. Well, his daughter Fatima was there alongside the Prophet throughout his prophetic life. Ali, her husband, was the cousin of the Prophet, the first male convert to Islam in Shia understanding, and therefore these two, Ali and Fatima, have privileged access to the way that the Prophet understood and interpreted and put the teaching of the Qur'an into practice. Also, he would teach them. He would share with them things that may not be obvious to other people. And so we see a privileged line of transmission coming through the family, through Fatima and Ali. And they, of course, would pass on that privileged knowledge to their two sons, the second and third Imams, Hassan and Hussein. And therefore we can see that there's a privileged line of transmission coming down through the Imams in the Shia system. Who are these Imams? Well, in Shia understanding, the Imams are the recipients of illumination, of inspiration from God. Therefore, they are guided by God by an inner light of knowledge, which is a channel into the divine world. More than this, they are protected from sin by this light and knowledge from God. Therefore, they are infallible and they are sinless, impeccable. Therefore, if they say that a hadith is authentic, they are then speaking infallibly, and this then gives us a really solid basis for the authentication of Hadith, so that the chain of transmitters has to either begin with Prophet himself, with Ali, who was there in the presence of the Prophet and heard him say, or it must contain one of the infallible Imams in the chain of transmission. And for the most authentic Hadith, all the transmitters have to be Shia. Why? Well, if we remember back to one of the things that divides Sunni and Shia communities, there is the question of who should succeed the Prophet. Now, in Shia understanding, the Qur'an spoke on this question and Ali was divinely appointed. The Prophet spoke on this question and he affirmed the divine appointment of Ali. This was done publicly. There were thousands of early Muslims who were present. They are all companions. Therefore, some of those companions knowingly went against the guidance of God and the guidance of the Prophet within the Shia understanding. Therefore, you can hardly rely on those people as being competent transmitters, trustworthy transmitters of whatever came from the Prophet himself. And therefore, rather than take a blanket understanding of the companions of the Prophet, in the Shia tradition, every single individual must be investigated and analyzed and authenticated in their own right. So it is possible for somebody who is a Sunni but of impeccable character to be a transmitter but not of the two most highly respected of the hadiths within the Shia system. In addition to this questioning about the early period, it is also within the Shia books that some of the early collections of hadith have been lost. They were available in the time of the Imams, but they have been lost since. Therefore, we are reliant upon the infallible guidance of the Imams so that they can authenticate and guide us back to the actual words of the Prophet. Now, this was fine up until the year 941, because up until that time, one of the infallible Imams was always in the midst of the community, and therefore you could go and receive infallible guidance. But from 941 onwards, recording those hadith that had been authenticated according to this tradition became more and more important. The four great collections of Shia hadith were collected in the 10th and 11th centuries by Al-Kulaini, for example, who dies in 939, and then by Ibn Babawa, who dies in 991. And then the second and third of these great collections are from the great scholar Al-Tusi. Now, you then have a body of collected hadith which are approved through the Shia system of proofing, going back to the Imams, going back to individually investigated and approved and authenticated transmitters who have to be Shia for the first two categories of Sahih and Hasan. There are many hadith that are in both collections, both the Sunni collection and the Shia collection. And so many of these hadith are commonly shared. Sometimes we find that there may be a different line of transmission. Sometimes we find that in one school there may be a longer hadith. It starts the same in both and then it is longer. Sometimes that extension is particular to one particular school rather than the other. But often we find that there is a good deal of overlap in the practical matters of how to live out a Muslim life between both schools. It's in the particularities, either of the Sunni or of the Shia school, that the differences in Hadith come about. There's a great deal of technical information available about the Hadith material, and if you go to my website, you can download an article there which will take you a little further into understanding this very important aspect of Islamic studies. Remember that you can find all the earlier episodes of Understanding Islam on the on-demand section of the Ahlul Bayt website. I look forward to being with you again next week, when we'll be looking at the great theological schools of Islam and the theologians that form them. I look forward to seeing you then.